apart from that, wonderful panel. This is our scheduled latest panel. Just answer questions. If I just start off with a question, you've got an idea, we'll go free form wherever. Writing trends, can I ask, the panel, do you find it sort of, that your publishers or pressure you into directions, as you get, your passion comes along, the cyberpunk dark future seems to be the thing at the moment.
I'm far too old to pay any attention to cyber rock. I don't get it.
How much pressure is there really on writers, or even on the publishing side, to write this way or that way?
Tom Doherty did say to me, Brian, exorcism and the Antichrist is going to be big next year. He did. They said, do me a trilogy. I said, no. Well, I've got one you can have, then we'll go on. And he said, all right, we'll have it. And they bought that. And it's quite serious. So look for it in America next year. Like Vampires are big this year, was big last year. Exorcism and the Antichrist is going to be big next year. Doherty says so. He tell you the same thing. I'm going to see you next week.
He can tell you, that's not going to do it any good.
Didn't do any good with me either, so yeah, they do try, and I think it's the cause of a lot of duff stuff, I feel like, because the writer who wants to break in and get some really good money up front. Of course, if Tom Doherty had said that somebody with no track record, he'd said wow, and rushed out and written 17 miserable exorcists or Antichrist stories. Well, that's my experience there.
Well, I was once commissioned by Futura MacDonald to do a juvenile series about dinosaurs. Adrian Desmond's book, The Warm-Blooded Dinosaur, had just come out. And it happened that dear Anthony Cheetham was a dinosaur buff. And he had approached Harry Harrison and, oh no, I don't have any time for that. Ask Anne MacCaffery, she needs the bread. He was quite right, I did. So he approached me and they sent me an outline of the 3 books. And I looked them over, puked, and said, may I do something slightly different? Oh yeah, go ahead. Well, there was good money up front and we really needed it. So I was charging away on the first book, aimed at a juvenile market. 147 pages, 150 pages, usual thing. When suddenly Anthony called me and he said, Anne, we'd really like this to be an adult story. Well, I was having trouble enough making dinosaurs even remotely interesting. So you know they were stupid as all hell. And I know that Anthony wanted something, as adorable as the dragons. Well, I'm sorry. Dinosaurs ain't dragons. There's no way I could make them lovable. I picked the best of the bad lot, the Grandmas. They seem to be intelligent. And I gussied them up a bit. And then they sent me over an editor. Oh, she was a sweet, pretty young thing. And she said, well, there are a few things, Anne, I feel we've got to expand here. You haven't told us about what a generationship is. Well, that's very easy, people just stay on board and there's family after family born. And what do you mean by a compound ship? That's a ship that has several different areas for different atmospheres, methane or ammonia, and different gravities for the different species. Oh, and you really have to explain transuranium. I said, well, that's the easiest of all. It's after uranium in the periodic table. What's the periodic table? If anyone is wondering why I put them to sleep in a cliff, it was to hope that by the time they woke up, I'd have another editor. Which I did. And I must say I enjoyed the second book much better than I did the first. And since then, as you know, I've gone on to do a collaborative series of another 3 with Elizabeth Moon and Jody Lynn Nye. But that was the only time that I was commissioned specifically to do a book. Most of the time I will say, I've got an idea for a book, and the publisher says, oh yes, what? Because I had never put in, well, the first 3 outlines I gave to Betty Valentine. I never wrote the story. I wrote something else from the same starting point, but I never wrote the story. And this confused my American contemporary editor. I did the Caradine Touch, because I had had to submit to the price, the advance they were paying me. I was willing. I submitted an outline. Eventually I didn't write to it. And I thought someone would have tipped her. And I never write to the outline I submit. But she didn't get it. But to go back to having ideas handed to you, in the late 50s and early 60s, I was fortunate enough to be able to be near enough to go and meet John Campbell of Analog magazine. And he was a brilliant editor. He would periodically go up to MIT and see what the research buffos were doing up there. So he was au courant of a lot of the scientific breakthroughs we were making all through that age, that 15-year span. And very often, John would get a group of us authors and then take us out for lunch. And I remember one lunch, there was Gordy Dixon, Keith Walner, Jack Williamson, myself, and somebody else I've forgotten who now. And he sat down and he told us the latest things they were doing at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology lab. And he just sort of flanged out these ideas. And sometimes they were he would counter himself, he would counter-argue himself, and he'd throw it out. And of course we were going listening, and somebody was scribbling notes, I think Jack Williamson was. And what he did was to throw these things out, knowing that he would get back 5 or 6 totally different stories, because each author thinks in certain patterns that would be unlikely to be reproduced by anybody else. We put our own experience in what we write. And sure enough, within the next year, I saw stories by those people, and I had one myself. And from the same material we were given, totally disparate stories appeared, each a very logical extrapolation of whatever John had told us that time. And he was marvelous at this. He really was a superb editor. We don't have anyone. Ben Bow was nearly like him, but no one matches the way John could bring on a writer. And that was one of the biggest pieces of luck I had in the field, that he and some of the other editors were so willing to encourage the young writers, new writers. It wasn't young. Here endeth that lesson.
Does anyone have a question? No.
How do you come up with the names of your characters?
Oh, that's the easiest thing in the world.
I didn't know.
What you do is, this is the easiest one I've ever found. I used to take signposts which had dropped letters, and I compressed them. And it would be almost English, but not quite. Or road signs, where the letters have dropped away. They make very good alien names if you have a lot of consonants. No one ever pronounces these things. But if you look at the credits on any BBC, ITV, UTV program, there are so many ethnic variations there that all you have to do is write them as they come off, and then screw them up. And you have they sound logical, and they sound as if they could be some of these names, and indeed, occasionally, they are. Whoops. Now, for instance, in The Dragon's Dawn, I don't know where I got Joel Lillienkamp, but he happened to be one of the other computer programmers in my son's office in Locust in Los Angeles. And Joel kept saying, "You told her about me." And Todd said, "No, I never mentioned your name." He said, "Well, how did I come to be the quartermaster?" I said, "I don't know, I'll ask my mother." You know, pure happenstance, I must have seen Joel Smith and Ezra Lillienkamp and put the two together. So that's the easiest thing. And what you do is you pick out whole lists of names that sound interesting. You make them up ahead of time. And then you have the list there. And when suddenly, like, God, I need a name, you look down the list, no, that's not right. No, that's a villain name. That's too sweet. Ah, yes, this one will do. Then you cross it out. And you've got a ready-made list of names.
I have one interesting one. I mean, I use the telephone book. But I have one interesting one. When I was doing Necroscope, I wanted a name that sounded like Dracula but wasn't. For Dragozani, for the necromancer. I wanted an Arnie name because there are plenty of them in Romania. So I wanted to think it ended with Arnie, so I had Arnie. And the Agozar came in the middle, just fell in there, so it came on Dragozani, and it sounds right. And it sounds vampire-ish. Dragozani, so I used it, tried it on myself a few times. Also, it could be whispered from the grave, Dragozani. Good, great, got it. So now we go to the map, because I'm wanting to follow Harry Keogh's adventures through Romania. So I'm looking at Romania, I'm looking in the area of Târgoviste and Pitești and Ploiești, and up and down the routes there, bang, there's a town there called Dragozani. Really, the only difference with the letter, my character is called Dragozan, but the place where I wanted this man born was here on the map, and it was called Dragazani. That was the only difference in the name. Synchronicity for you. I mean, this was where I wanted him to be born. And of course he was named after the town. That's how he came to be named after the town in the story. But in actual fact, the town was named after him. That's true.
Do you think maybe he really exists and he whispered it in your mind? The names are very important. I think they're a crucial part of your book. I mean, an awful lot can fall by the wayside with a name. And even your minor characters that come on and off, and some of them don't want to get off, they want to carry on. They have their own book. They have, I think it's important to get the names, whether it's an Earth contemporary name, or whether it's something really evocative. I think that, I don't think you ought to go crazy with every name and really try to get the most fantastic name for every name. They've got to have the right kind of sound, different ways of doing it, whether you get a Scrabble board and jumble up the names and that, or whether you merge words. One of my villains in the Amaran saga is called Simon Wargallow. War and gallow, two very powerful emotive words. That one just sort of fell out of space into my head and straight away went down. Others I had to play around with a long time. And titles as well. I think titles are very important.
I have a computer program rigged up for as many as 13 letters, all ending in TH. And I run it when I need dragon names. You'd be amazed at how often Ruth appears. So I just, I run the program, scratch out some more names.
I had some fun with the Star Requiem series because I had several cultures set on several different worlds, which were all I had several different cultures. Some were human-based, some were alien-based, some were fusions of the two. And I had this particular powerful military-based or military-rooted semi-aliens. And I decided that, their names have got to sound, each culture's got to sound similar within itself, but very different to each other. I was to get very, very confused. So for the aliens, I integrated their titles, their military titles, their ranks with their name. So each name ends with Tsar or Gar, because that's the first three letters of their title. And I've actually put an index in the books as well, so that, just in case there is any confusion. But you very soon, or I very soon, began to fall into a pattern of doing it. It became very easy, and I would hope that the reader would get used to that very quickly.
I suppose in a nutshell then, really, if any percent of what you read and do blockbuster novel about John Smith, he's going to wait a long time.
Certainly in my case.
Part of the writer's craft is to work out names, and what you said, you have to, certain names have kind of feelings attached to them, don't they? I think partly from childhood, maybe people that you've met in primary school or something, and certain names you just associate with certain characteristics, and we all bear that with us. And the other part of it is choosing names which contrast as well, because, as you say, you don't want too many names that are similar or have just two syllables in them. Otherwise, the reader can easily get confused at the beginning. You want to make each name special to the character and provide a variety of names within the book. And I think that the best writers, it comes naturally to them as part of the
We've got lists, that's
I'm very often put off reading a book by reading the blurb and seeing awful names, which they're not just unpronounceable, but they just do not have an instant feel.
like Pug, from Raymond Feist's hero. Pug.
Yeah. Like there's somebody called Hen or something. Is that in the film? Was it Bulgaria? Sorry about that. Bulgaria. Bulgaria. There were a couple of things.
Called what?
Hen, I think.
Hen.
Something like that.
There's an observation I make is if you're going to go around driving around looking for names, don't drive around out the office.
There's nothing wrong with Crapstone then. They put a sign under Crapstone now, actually. It's very unfortunate. They've got a public toilet sign.
It's emotive.
Our council's really proud of it to be public toilet, but they didn't put the sign on.
There's a vision, there's this huge battle and all the orcs and all the dragons and all the elves are beating up somebody. And finally somebody stands aloft with his sword and says, "I, King Crapstone!" This doesn't seem to work.
The Crapstone is the token they're questing for, surely.
Well, before we get ideas of what you think this idea is a load of rubbish, can we have another question, please? No, we want another question. Yes.
A very simple one. Is it Pimu, Piemu?
Pimer.
Pimer. We all know.
I got his name and quite a few others from the Latin endings of pluperfect and, super pluperfect, whatever that was. I just went through Latin grammar. And Ilishandra is a brand name for butter in Ireland. It seemed much too pretty to
Well, you
wait
should
on.
charge him, that's all I can say.
You pick them up odd places.
Another question, please? No? I've worked for money. Write the names. What motivates you to write a particular story? It's within a series, but on one-off. Is it, I've got this sequence of events, who's in it? Or do you come up with people and then what are you going to do?
About a year and a half ago, a tape appeared in my mail. And it says, Leslie Fish. And it said, please listen to the tape. Carmen Miranda's ghost is haunting the space station 3. All the crew have seen her and the portmaster and me. And if you think we've had too much of Cookie's homemade rum, then tell me where those basket hats of fruit keep coming from. Now, I write a story about Carmen Miranda's ghost on a space station or any other ghost. But I thought this was hilarious. So I sat down and I did write a story. I had some other stuff I was fiddling with. And there have been glitches in the computer which have produced all kinds of crazy things happening on the space station. And they don't know why Carmen Miranda picked them. Maybe, they didn't have phase generators when she was alive. It was fairly easy to write the story. It sort of became, wow! And I called it, If Madam Likes You. The Lessons Are Free, which was a Carmen Miranda. A lot of you are too young to remember Carmen Miranda.
Oh, you know we've done more.
Yes, I did. And so it was fairly easy to write the story. In fact, sit for a week and then went back and cleaned it up and sent it off. And I was one of the first authors to comply. But a lot of us sent in stories because it was such a wacky way to plug for an anthology. So that's what happens sometimes. It just clicks.
What I'm finding at the moment is I've only in the last year or so started to try and write short stories again. I did it years ago, not very successfully. I've always found it a hard medium. I think the word process has actually helped me because I go through a lot of drafts. But most of my short stories now are based on fears which affect me and other people. And perhaps the most potent example at the moment is that during the course of the last year, after 40 odd years, I've started to learn to drive. And driving for me is more than just the parcel of terrors that it is for everybody that starts to learn to drive. It's always been a real phobia when I'm behind the wheel. Perfectly happy as a passenger. I could be with the most crazy driver in the world and be happy as a passenger. Behind the wheel, it's real phobia. And I haven't quite cracked it yet, but I'm almost there. I'm not frightened of driving anymore. I am, in fact, I actually enjoy it. I'm taking a test for the third time with some confidence. But I use the fear of driving as the theme for writing a short story. I thought maybe I can get this out of my system, really out of my system, by writing a story about a guy that every time he gets behind the wheel with his instructor, there's something behind him that he can never see, because every time he turns his head it moves, but it's there. And I wrote this story and I sent it off to a new magazine called Skeleton Crew. And it was the fastest sale I've ever achieved, because within 5 days the editor wrote back to me and said, I love this story. I've not long failed my driving test myself. It's scaring shit out of me. So, well, I've only passed this test next time, I'll maybe put him off driving for life. But that's the kind of thing. I mean, there are things, as Anne said, I think occasionally you're given an opportunity to write something and think around what you're doing. But by and large, I try to draw it from. Sometimes it's a very personal thing as well. I mean, that was, and in certain areas, it can be difficult to come to terms with the fear that you're trying to address, but it's worth doing.
Money is a good inspiration. But that's not being cynical. It is a good inspiration. And when you get the guy who not only approaches you and says, I want a story about, but this is what we're paying. That's, the combination does set things jiggling in your head, gets things going. It's always helpful if the editor knows what he wants you to do. I hate having to think of what I'm going to write next. But if somebody says to me, I want a story about, it sets the gears in motion, and I can go from there. Usually I don't have to worry about that. There's always something bubbling, turning over. I believe in planting a little seed in your head and throwing in a heap of compost and letting it all rot in there a while and see what comes up through the muck,
What little flower?
That's a different fantasy about it.
Is that how Necroscope actually started?
It muck, but it's building.
So they said we want a vampire story.
No, absolutely not. I can say that he's misleading you. He doesn't work that way at all.
I do.
He does very occasionally, when somebody approaches him and they've got a specialised anthology and they say, it's got this kind of theme. And if he's got an idea already there, then obviously he can develop that into a story. But as far as Necroscope came, he was just fascinated with the idea of vampires.
I wanted a different kind of vampire.
And wanted to do something very different. And really, as his agent, it was a good thing he didn't listen to my advice. Because, having heard too much, this is interesting because it goes back to your earlier question about trends and whether what publishers are trying to guess will sell, affects what people write. A lot of people complain, say, oh, everything's turning into trilogies these days, and this kind of stuff. So O'Brien said, I've got to write number 2, and I said, well, do you really think that's a good idea, because there's too many of them around? He said, no, I've got to do it. And it's just there, and it just insisted on being written. Just this fascination with the idea, the characters.
I think the reason for trilogies is not a bad one, because it shows that writers very often are writing at the top of their skill, and while they have answered the questions that that particular premise brings up, having solved one set of problems, you're going to get another, and you suddenly see, well, gee, this is going to happen. And you keep trying to end things up happily ever after. It doesn't work that way. You end up with however many books in the trilogy, you get the major problems all sorted out.
And of course, a writer is always inspired by a book as well.
Yeah, that is true.
It is true. I mean, it sounds ridiculously obvious, but it's not really obvious unless you're a writer.
Feedback from the readers,
Yeah.
they're excited. And
You know,
suddenly
people
you're-
come running up to you and say, hey, I love this story. And if your publisher comes running up to you and say, hey, I love this story.
Listen.
You know, it's a hell of a good incentive to get on and do the next one and the next one and the next one.
You know, people are interested in the same thing that you're interested in. That's great, isn't it?
And they're comfortable
Yes.
with an ambience they already know. Because they can sort of, like this comfortable chair, you can settle right back into it and go on.
Read more about your favourite characters and meet some new ones.
Yeah.
Or on the edge of it, if it's aliens or
Yeah.
something like that.
Would it be fair to say that when you're saying that, comes up, I'm looking for this kind of story, do you tend to find you've got on the back burner, you've got 8 or 9 ideas, I want to do this while I'm waiting, and then the next week he says, I want a story, that one, and you will write it.
Yeah, it can happen, yes. I've always got a number of ideas, which, I mean, the intention is that I will write them one way or another, whether somebody asks for them or not, but sometimes it falls
do
in.
you have, I've got this story back here, and I'm waiting for the paycheck, or do you find that sometimes you think, I've got the idea of the story, you start writing, and by the time you finish, is the story you thought of?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, never the same
It even
one.
ends up being, you've got 2 stories, you think, I'll take A, and you write it, it ends up being B. I mean, or do you tend to find that when you're stuck on something?
Well, I find writing short stories incredibly difficult.
They are.
And I think of the beginnings of short stories really well. I've got hundreds of great starts, and I can never think of a great ending. I think that's the most difficult thing, because a short story tends to come in, one verse. I don't know about the others on the panel, but you conceive of a short story as a whole. You know what the ending is going to be, and you have to know that because it's such a tight medium. Whereas with a novel, obviously, you can start with a place and characters and let them carry you where they want. So I find that great ideas don't help you that much because I've got to know the ending, and that's the difficult part. That's the clever part.
Yeah.
The other thing I noticed, you're talking about how trilogies seem to be popular. Is that a case there that quite often you're finding ideas that you may have had in the first book that maybe hinted at before you talked about it and dropped? Reoccur later on. I'm thinking in terms of particularly in the film context. When Star Wars came out, it was a completely different film to the original draft. It was a girl rescuing her brother. By the time they got to the 3rd film, they were brother and sister, the roles reversed. They had ideas as it developed. They thought, I still want to do that. I'll put it at the end rather than the beginning because it followed on that way.
Well, I don't happen to write with the idea of writing trilogies. It just happened. Frank Herbert once told me with a perfectly straight face that he had written the outlines for all of the Dune books. I don't believe him.
I heard the last, pressure of the fans that persuaded him to go on.
Certainly Dune was a classic in its time, it just blew your mind. And I think it was the fans wanted to know what happened. And he told me with his perfectly straight face that he had all of them. And he thought because we weren't doing trilogies in those days. We weren't doing extended novels. Once in a while you have somebody doing it, but it wasn't the done thing. And then in the 70s, as the readership broadened, and sort of, I suppose, because we had Star Trek episode after episode, and Star Wars, and Raiders of the Lost Ark, and then Indiana Jones was continuing, people got used to the idea. And there's always been in mystery the detective who is carried through Oh, yeah, thanks very much, Steve. Some people here have asked about my Gothics, and this is where you can order them. They're now in an omnibus, and they're not easily available here in England. In fact, they're out of print. Anybody wants one?
Sorry, we'll go on.
You
You can fight for it at the end of the show, folks, when it takes all.
The idea of the theme continuing. Necroscope wasn't supposed to be a series at all, it was a one-off. As I got on to writing the second and the third and the fourth, and the final book, threads, God knows how they found their way into the first novel, became apparent. Readers will swear, I'm sure, that it was my intention to do this right from square one, but it wasn't, or if it was, I didn't know about it. But there was stuff in the first book which demanded an explanation or a requirement, which I didn't know was there until I had to write the second one or the third one. But I think that's something that's in all writers, really. We cater to it. And sometimes I go back and read stories and I can't remember how I wrote the thing. I think that's damn good. I don't remember doing that.
Yeah, you can surprise yourself.
It's not very often that you think, well, it may be, but I find that when I finish the story, I don't very often think that. I tend to think, well, wish I could have done it better. But when I get away from it, a year or 2 years, I look back and think, I wrote that story's better than I thought at the time. But as far as the trilogies, and in my case, a couple of quartets are concerned, go back to the Frank Herbert thing, they're very hard because to imagine that he'd done drafts for them. Because I was asked to, when I'd done the O'Meara series, I was asked what had I got in mind for something else, and I said, well, I've got what looks like being a fairly large science fiction, fantasy, come horror fusion again. And my editor said, well, we would like another series if you'd like to do one. And I said, well, it's quite a big idea, so it probably would run to a trilogy or a quartet again. And she said, well, give me an outline of it, and get as much of an outline as the first volume as you can. So I wrote a fairly detailed 12, 15-page synopsis of the whole saga, with a 5 or 6 detailed synopsis of the first book, which I'd actually started on. And the finished quartet, which is now being published, is nothing like that original draft, because by the time you get to the end of the first book, you've written for the first time the detail of the saga. So you've got to go back to your draft, your plan of volume 2, if you like, and the whole thing's going to be completely changed. You wrote that before you'd written the first book. There's so many things in the first book that now need addressing in the second one, and so it goes on. And the original, each volume, as you write it, is further and further away from your original plan. I mean, I had an overriding plan to it, but spontaneity, I think, from the way I work, is very, very important, because there are so many characters in there who I have no idea that how important they're going to be until I start writing about them, because they want to tell their own story and they won't let me push them off stage. They want to come on.
A lot of writers are very worried by synopses, because they always say, but the story when I eventually write it is going to be totally different.
And much better.
I always tell my publisher,
I can't give you a really good, synopsis.
Nick Austin in Grafton says, do me a synopsis, then, Brian. I know you won't. It's probably won't be anything like it, but at least it gives me a wage with the rest of the people at Grafton. He knows it's not going to be anything like that, but he needs something to show people.
Yeah.
Look, this is the new Brian Owen. It's not. This is something I thought of this morning for Nick.
David Eddings actually sent to Lester Del Rey a treatment for the Mallory. The Belgarian. This long, this thick, in which he had the whole history and everything all listed out. And Lester didn't realize it was the background material. He said, well, this is all very well and good, but there's no plot line. David wrote back and said, that's just the background. Here's the novel. And sent in the first one. But then, incredible.
Do you ever find that the characters and the books tend to write themselves?
They have done. They'll walk away with you.
I mentioned Simon Morgan from the Armadacon, so he was intended to play a fairly major part in the first volume as a villain, out-and-out villain. Although I tend not to be black and white. I mean, most of my characters have got a bit of evil in them, even if they're good guys, and the bad guys, you know, I'm more interested in the grey areas than that. But Wargallow became so interesting because he changes his views, and in action he becomes more of a hero than a villain at the end. But I mean, he took over and became the principal character of the entire saga. I mean, he became the main character. And people have actually said, when are you going to do some more? Is he really dead? You know? So, well, I don't know. But yeah, he took over. Yeah, I didn't plan it that way. They become real, so you live with them. You know, I often get them at 3 o'clock in the morning to go to the loo, and it may only take 2 or 3 minutes, but in that time, my mind goes through an amazing number of ideas, apparently conversations as well, because my wife's like,
You've got a shithead.
I'm trying to be talking to some strange guy last night at 3 o'clock. No, you know. I got 3 chapters out of that, so don't worry. In 2 minutes.
You can imagine his wife going to the loo after him, and then he rushed in and said, "Don't touch that toilet roll!" Oh, God, he's just pushed 3 chapters down.
White papers.
Another question.
Have any of the writers ever used material in their books that they've got from their own dreams?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, a couple of nightmares, actually, in my case. But I don't bad dream frequently. When I do, it's a real killer. It was one last night, where Dot had to wake me up. I won't tell you what it's about. It's
Fighting in sleep and talking.
yeah, bikers, I was giving them hell.
As long as you're on the winning end of the bikers, congratulations.
Well, I used to be I was a military policeman for 22 years, and some of these characters I had to deal with do crop up occasionally in my dreams. Yeah. But no, I've had some nightmares which have been really vivid, and I've woken up and written a quick outline. One very short thing was in a British Fantasy Society publication. It wasn't a story as such. And I actually dreamed this. I was out shopping on an evening, and there was a store, and you could see people moving about through the plate glass, and a young woman went in ahead of me, and I thought, well, they must have a sale on or something, maybe the cigarettes are cheap before the budget or something like this. It's my dream. It looked like a vivid dream. So I went into the store after the young lady. Inside, all the people milling about vanished. The windows were black. You could see in, you couldn't see out. The young lady was still ahead of me, and she's on a kind of treadmill. And she couldn't come away from the treadmill. She's being moved towards the wall, and there's a red light on the wall saying, "Stand still, don't worry, don't run away, just come to me." And in the end, she stopped trying to run away and drifted towards this wall and vanished. And now I'm on the treadmill, and the light is, the speaker in the wall is saying, "Don't worry, stand, don't worry." With the young lady gone, you know. I find I'm adept at being in a lift and getting trapped. This happens to me. And getting out by forcing the crack open. I'm a big lad. So I did this with a black wall and was out in the street. And the heart slowed down. I'm still fast asleep. I haven't woken up yet. And there, a few minutes later, I bumped into this young lady who's got to carry a bag in her hand. Now before, she was a good-looking girl. Shiny hair, shiny eyes, nice complexion. Now she's very sallow, grey-looking. And her bag is dripping red. And I know that her soul is in the bag. I turn around and look at the supermarket, and the door hisses open once, and there's a red eye looking at me, and then the door closes. And I wake up. Of course. It's a beauty. It's an actual dream. So 2 or 3 like that, they've all ended up on paper because they were too good to waste.
You've been shopping at Tesco's, haven't you?
All the time.
Another question. Alright, what? Is there, have you ever gone into a book and got so far and thought, it's not doing what I want and stopped? Or do you think I've started, I'll finish?
Now, when a book sort of won't write forward, I have found that there's usually an error in the story logic. And go back and figure out what the error was, and change it. Maybe sometimes it's going to a different viewpoint. Sometimes it's changing the scene. But very often, there's an error in the story logic. You go back and fix it, and then it starts out again. As if you run out of petrol, you need to fill the tank.
I find that there's a point in each book that I write, whether it's really flowing fast and furious, or whether it's going along at a nice pace. There's always a point where you think, yes, at last, I think I'm happy with this now. Sometimes it's fairly early on, sometimes it takes a long time. But usually, because I want to write that particular book, because I've chosen it from a number of ideas that I've got, that's the one I want to write about and I'm enthusiastic about, I can actually get on with it, and it's only the pace that varies. But there is always that uncertainty and that worry that perhaps it isn't quite right. And really, the only time that that's completely dispelled is when the editor says, this is fine, or maybe a couple of minor things that they're happy with it. But I've certainly had, for the 2 series that I wrote, once I got into those, the enthusiasm took over. I think I was happy watching it, I enjoyed it, and I hope that reflects in the actual text itself.
I've got 2 or 3 things sitting in the drawer that need finishing. Not many. You know, 6 or 7 pages into the story. I'm writing a spin-off trilogy from the Necroscope books, which will be bigger than the original, in fact. But, I developed a vampire world in them. And when I started to write number 1, I got 20 pages into it before realizing I was writing the wrong book. So that's sitting there waiting, that's another story. That's sitting there waiting to develop into something else.
Yes, I think one of the problems is you have an idea and you have some characters, and sometimes you don't actually know, as you say, story logic, the right place to start with them. Sometimes you start in the wrong place with them, and then you sort of put it on one side you need to start in another place, or quite often perhaps, especially with beginner writers, you find that first chapter that they write is the wrong one. They should have started at chapter 2. They're sort of writing background
The
stuff.
framework's wrong.
Yes, you need to incorporate it later. So it is quite often.
Well, I had 379 pages of Dragon Quest, and I couldn't put it forward. And Betty Valentine very kindly said, well, why don't you come up to my house, and we'll go through it. Now, if you've all been in writing competition courses and your teacher has scrolled through you with red marks, no, this is not proper development, or your syntax is wrong, and you will come home crushed because your baby wasn't accepted. Try it with a real editor, page by page, line by bloody line. And we were about halfway through the manuscript when Betty looked at me and she said, I know what's wrong with this. I said, yeah, what? She said, this isn't about Lesson Falar. It isn't? No, it's about Fëanor and Greggy. Oh my God. She was right. Once I had the proper perspective, the story fell into place. So I went back home, I rewrote the first 2 chapters, I finished the last of it, and it was Fëanor and Greggy's book. And that was been my problem. I had the right main characters. So it can happen, and it very often does. And sometimes you need an outside eye, and sometimes you just need to sit down, okay, what am I doing wrong that these characters don't like? And that's when you go back and you sort of sort out your story. Maybe all you need is another scene to explain something that will happen later. It's very difficult to say. You learn by doing in this craft more than in any other, I think.
Yeah.
You fiddle with the elements, and you learn to fiddle with them. And thank God for word processor, because then you can mix your paragraphs around without having to go through all that work of typing it out again.
find that if I've got a lot of characters in one particular time, I'm trying too hard to keep them all to the fore, and you've got to get perspective again. You've got to prioritise, and it doesn't necessarily mean killing them off, but you'll find that by taking them out of the main plot, it does become natural much more easy. That you think, yeah, that's exactly what I should have done. That's a good change. So it's very often in character, I think. It's the characters.
Might kill them off.
Yeah, well, I mean, you can do that. Sometimes it's handy to have them. Sometimes it's handy to have them in your sleeve for later.
Well, it's easy for me, so I can always bring them back.
Yeah, well, there you go.
Have you ever come up with an idea in your mind that you really want to do this book, but when you go about to try to type it down, you just can't seem to get started no matter what you do? How do you get about that, or whatever? Or if you...
I forget the idea immediately, because it's not going to run. Not all good ideas are writable.
Yeah, I mean, I use, as Brian was saying earlier on about letting them stew. I think most of the things that I write, it's not very often that I have an idea and sit down and start to work on it very soon. I tend that they've usually been around there in the morass for a while, and often bits and pieces meld together and then come out in one. Yeah, I mean, sometimes the first page is difficult because that's very important. Just as the title's important and the names are important, the first page, the first sentence, is important. But if the idea is strong enough, it'll find a way of expressing itself.
Usually, if you have a great idea and you try and sort of impose that into a story, that's where the problem arises. You need to really start with the characters and let the characters bring an idea into either the short story or the novel. You can quite often tell, you're sort of reading a novel, you can tell that the writer wants to make a point or wants to push a particular idea, and it just doesn't work because it comes over as dry. The best kind of storytelling is just that, it's telling a great story with great characters, and the kind of ideas are just sort of underneath the surface, you sort of glimpse them as you go. And I think it's a mistake to try and impose an idea.
That's why when somebody asks you, what influenced you in this book, Mrs. MacCaffery? How would I know? It's something I might have, read when I was 15. Or last week in a newspaper. And last week, is terra incognita until the right neurons go together. Anyway, it's called data retrieval malfunction. But you don't know what's going to suddenly impinge and say, hey, ooh, that's a good idea. And you put it in. So writers never stop working. They're always gathering information and making observations. Even last night, that quartet of bouncers. Hi, fellas! What wasn't the Rauschsmeisers? Marianne has some German friends staying with her. Yeah. What is it?
Rausschmeißer.
Rausschmeißer. One of these days, somebody's going to come up with a Rausschmeißer. And you will say, I know what that character is for.
I was there.
Another question? No. Okay. It seems to me that science fiction and fantasy writers are in some ways different from most other genres in that you have a lot more interaction with fans than many other types of writing. Do you find it's beneficial?
Yes, I do. Well, it's positive. Mostly it's positive feedback because they don't dare say any negative feedback.
They do.
They do?
Yeah. Oh, they want you because you're lady and nice.
You do get them in letters, though. You do get people.
Deliberately rude to me.
I think one of the things is, we've all got a real love for the genre, subgenre. We're all kindred spirits. Brian and I were talking about this last night. And one of the nice things about conventions and such like is you're talking about the writers that you like, the stories that you like, the titles and all the rest of it. And the fact that there are fans and there are writers, the divide disappears. You don't think about it. Don't think about that at all. And the informality of it as well is what makes. If I mean, I've been to some conventions where they are fairly stiff and formal, and they get a bit too intellectual, and that's all very well. But we come to have fun just the same as anybody else, and it does. I mean, feedback. Yeah, I mean, I usually go away from a convention and having spent a couple of days recovering, just a bit like 2 weeks jet lag usually. Then I'm on fire to start writing again. It's real positive feedback.
Yes, have you ever found you've played to write someone else's work without intending to?
Yeah. Yeah, I was three chapters into when I'm writing, I don't read. I don't read very much. I can always read Jack Vance, for example. Always. It doesn't interfere with my work at all, because a guy I consider to be in a class of his own.
Yes.
Yeah, so it doesn't interfere with my work. I can read Jack Vance and carry on my writing. I know I'm not going to steal anything from him. I can't. That's how high I place him above many another. So I can, but normally I don't. I won't read anybody else, and I won't look at anything. I won't look at anything else anybody else is doing. I won't read reviews or anything like this. So I'm 3 chapters into this, and the big chapters into this thing, and it's about a kind of last redoubt, like Hope Hodson's The Nightland kind of place, where humanity is going. It's an elephant's graveyard for humanity. It's the end of the world, but it's not the dying earth. People are going to this place, and this is going to be the last place. And it's, so I'm 3 chapters in, and I've got the title, and the title must be this title. And I walk downtown, and in the bookshop window, Stephen King's The Shining has just been released. Now, yeah, and my book is called The Shining. And it's not like Stephen King's book, of course, but it was enough to kill it. Dead, it was really enough to kill me. Looking for very high places or very fast motor cars in which to throw my wheels off. Oh, yeah, desperate.
I had a marvelous idea. Wouldn't it be wonderful if there was a diagnostic tool so small that it could be injected in the bloodstream? Or in the intestinal system, and that you could actually scope and diagnose peculiar diseases. And children got it in a lollipop, adults were either given a cigarette or a cup of coffee, and they took it in the other room. Someone was watching the trail or whatever thing it was. And, of course, it's a case of physician healed, eyes out, which in this case he couldn't do. And I was just beginning to wrap it up, and Fantastic Voyage came
I wrote Fantastic Voyage when I was 14. I did. I wrote about an injection of little men, little space-suited men, into the bloodstream to find and destroy a disease.
Yeah.
And I bet you a dozen other science fiction writers have done it as well.
There's one thing worse than this, is when you actually get your published book back from your publisher and you think, oh great, that's fine. I've got some, what I think are quite nice ideas in Star Requiem. I have these creatures called glider boats, and they started off, they were really just kind of more machine than anything else, but I really needed to get people from A to B quickly, so they were a convenient device, because I didn't want to use horses and that, and there was very little technology in this world, because it was a kind of collapsed world, so I had these glider boats. They became more interesting as the story went on, and they developed, and they are part human. They're humans who've been converted into machines. Their souls have been closed down, and they have a telepathic relationship with the controllers who use them. There's the glider boats. I think come out the 4 volumes are out. Last Christmas, I started reading Necroscope. Wonderful mansions that the Bound Fury wrote. I thought, my God, Brian Emery's Star Requiem, it's going to be on the phone quick. No, seriously, that's a coincidence. I mean, the glider boats and the mansions are not.
Dragons, you got this kind of.
I mean, there are. I think there was a forum we had the other day. We were talking about archetypes. I mean, there are archetypal ideas, and whether you subconsciously tap into them or not, it happens. But the really embarrassing ones are where you do bring a story out and you find that, literally a few weeks beforehand somebody else has brought the same story out. It's too late to change it, then it's out. But there is, I mean, whether there is a collective unconscious that we dig in.
Well, at one Milford conference I was at, we had 3 qui custodian stories. Who watches the Watcher? And we had 2 Frozen Summer stories. Now, these were writers who had no contact with each other during the course of the year, and they come up with a similar basis. The stories were totally different, but we were all sort of aghast. God, 3 and 2 out of 14, that was a pretty high average.
How was this for synchronicity? I was on a panel in Birmingham 2 years ago with a bunch of writers, and the panel was about synchronicity, and knew nothing about it until we got there. All of the characters on the panel were in the story I had just written, titled Synchronicity. That's true. I mean, it was published by, it was a small press publication. It was Carl Ford and Dagon who published it. And all, including the artist who illustrated, which was Dagon. He was also in the story.
Spirits just walking around.
One last question I've got for the panel. Coming back to your bit about the science fiction niche, is there any particular type of story you ever want to write that's so different from what you've done? A comedy, a western? Have you ever wanted to write something really different and still what?
I do.
Well, I'm basically a horror writer. I've always written horror stories, but the Dreamland series, they're fantasies set in Lovecraft's Dreamland. So I suppose we all do different things.
I have had editors tell me, no, this isn't the type of story we want from you, Anne. Why not? It's a good story. But it's not what we want from you.
It's not the sort of story you write.
Well, it's a good idea to have different books.
Well, I do now.
Yeah.
My initial publisher is having hairy knicker attack. That's their problem.
Yeah, I've got a couple of things which, I mean, I'm writing short horror fiction. I write a variety within, I mean, I've got humorous pieces, and I write the sort of heroic fantasy, and now this kind of strange fusion thing I'm doing. But I'd like to, there's a particular historical novel I'd like to write, probably in the Arthurian period, but it may be a fantasy novel anyway. And also I've got a particular horror novel that I want to write, but they won't let me write it yet. Maybe for good reason, but I think when the timing's right, I'll do it. It'll, you know, I'll know when the timing's right. Then come hell or high water, I will write that book. If you really want to write it, if it's something that you've got that burning drive to do, then I think it will force itself to a goal.
And I'm afraid that's the time to be responsible. So I thank Adrian Cole, Brian, and Anne MacCaffery.